Hello there, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Sunday the 12th of February. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is the Full Scottish. This afternoon, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 354 of the illegal Russian war of aggression and imperial ambition. Then I'll introduce our guest for this afternoon's programme, and then together we will bring you this week's headlines from Scotland and around the world. Russia's defence ministry said its forces had carried out a massive strike on critically important energy facilities of Ukraine's military-industrial complex on Friday. Ukraine's energy minister, German Galushenko, has said that Russia had power facilities in 6 regions with missiles and drones, causing blackouts across most of the country. Ukraine's state energy operator, Ukrenergo, has said the situation in the country's energy system is challenging but controlled. First reports indicate that 3 Russian S-300 missiles hit the eastern Ukrainian city of Kharkiv on Saturday night, according to the regional governor, Ole Syniehubov. Ukraine's forces are holding defence along the front line in Donetsk, including the besieged town of Bakhmut, with the fiercest battles raging for the cities of Vuhledar and Mariinika. Evgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner mercenary group, has acknowledged that his forces are facing fierce resistance around Bakhmut from Ukrainian defenders. He said it could take 2 years for Russia to fully control the Donetsk and Luhansk regions in eastern Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said yesterday that he had issued a decree sacking a senior security figure and said separately that his drive to clean up the government would continue. Russia is ready for negotiations with Ukraine, but without preconditions. State media has reported that the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Vershinin is saying. Russia's Sports Minister Oleg Matitsyn has said that Ukraine's call to ban Russian athletes from the 2024 Paris Olympics was unacceptable. 35 countries will demand that Russia and Belarusian athletes are banned from the Games, according to the Lithuanian Sports Minister Jurgita Šurgždinienė. A proposed resolution for adoption by the UN's General Assembly has underlined the need for peace, ensuring Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity. Zemfira, one of Russia's most popular singers, has been placed on a list of foreign agents on grounds that she supported Ukraine and criticized Russia's special military operation in that country, according to the Russian Justice Ministry. The ministry has added several other people to its foreign agents list, including opposition politician Dmitry Gudkov, political analyst Abbas Galyamov, and the activists Alexandra Kazantseva and Tatiana Nazarbayeva for LGBT propaganda. And immigration authorities in Argentina are cracking down on Russian women travelling to Buenos Aires to give birth in order to gain Argentinian citizenship for their children since the invasion of Ukraine. Now, we are lucky enough this afternoon to be joined by Councillor Dr. Siobhan Tolland. Siobhan is an SNP councillor for Lochee and Dundee, is also a community and political activist. She's a founding member of the community group Dundee Together, and she's a member of the UCU Union. Siobhan, good afternoon. How are you keeping?
Not too bad, not too bad. Very chaotic times, but maybe very hopeful ones as well.
Well, that's a good point, Siobhan. I was going to reflect with you very briefly. I know that yesterday you attended the commemoration of the 17 Dundee men who died in Spain fighting fascism during the Spanish Civil War. As you said on Facebook, in the 1930s, Spain was subject to fascism, and many people in the UK decided to go and fight to try and defeat it, and that these were ordinary individuals who had no help from the UK state and who bravely gave their lives. So I was just going to ask you briefly, what struck you about the commemoration of these men yesterday?
The humanity of it. Honestly, this was just ordinary men that made a choice to go. and their families sacrificed as a result. You know, if men were on benefits, the families wouldn't get benefits if they went across and fought. So there was a real kind of family problem as well in terms of the families that they left behind to do. What struck me most of all yesterday was the age range of people coming. A lot were older people, but there was a lot of youngsters as well, appreciating that connection, I think, between today and the past, and how it's a constant struggle for democracy and anti-fascism. One of the things that struck me yesterday, and to my shame I can't remember the name, it was the name of one of the men that died. His parting words to his mum was, if we don't fight it across here, we'll be fighting it. If we don't fight it across there, rather, we'll be fighting it across here soon enough. And I think unfortunately he did die, but his words came to pass maybe. So it was a very kind of touching ceremony. It's not just Dundee, it was kind of areas across Scotland and the UK that always mark that commemoration. It struck me this morning as I was thinking it over that we we don't often see fascism when it's right in front of us. It's something that we maybe look back and think, oh Lord, you know, but these people recognised that and immediately tried to prevent it from happening. It didn't quite work out, unfortunately, but they did give an ultimate sacrifice, I think, and it's something that's not necessarily, um, it's not given the credit, I think, that they perhaps should have done, that personal sacrifice and the sacrifice that their families made as well to allow that.
That's a very good point, Siobhan. Thank you. I suspect we're going to be touching on one or two of those topics you've just mentioned as we discuss this week's headlines this afternoon together. But let's move to our first item today, because as the rescue efforts continue following the devastating earthquakes in Turkey and Syria, I've got for you a brief summary of recent events. The death toll from Monday's earthquake has surpassed 28,000 people. The Turkish Vice President said last night the death toll in his country had risen to 24,617, and Agence France Presse has reported that there have been 3,553 deaths in Syria. The UN Emergency Relief Coordinator Martin Griffiths said the death toll from the earthquake is likely to more than double, adding that he expected tens of thousands more deaths. He visited the Turkish province of Kahramanmaraş on Saturday, describing the earthquake as the worst event in 100 years in the region. A spokesman for the UN Secretary-General has told the BBC that it is time to put all politics aside to deliver aid to Syria. Stefan Dujarric, the spokesperson for the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, added that it was hard to imagine a more complex emergency in Syria. Turkey's President Tayyip Recep Erdogan has warned that looters will be punished after reports of people taking goods in earthquake-hit areas. Turkish authorities arrested 48 people for looting or trying to defraud victims, Turkish state media reported yesterday. And Turkish police have detained 12 people over collapsed buildings on the southeastern provinces of Gaziantep and Sanliurfa, including building contractors, following the huge quake that hit Turkey, local media has reported yesterday. Turkish officials have issued more than 100 arrest warrants in connection with the poor construction of buildings that collapsed in Monday's earthquakes. Facing questions over his handling of Turkey's most devastating earthquake since 1939, President Erdogan promised to start rebuilding within weeks, saying hundreds of thousands of buildings have been wrecked. The European Union's envoy to Syria has urged Damascus not to politicise issues of humanitarian aid, rejecting accusations as unfair that the bloc had failed to provide sufficient help to Syrians. It is absolutely unfair to be accused of not providing aid, when actually we have constantly been doing exactly that for over a decade, and we are doing so much more even during the earthquake crisis, Dan Stoanescu has told Reuters. A border gate between Turkey and Armenia opened for the first time in 35 years on Saturday to allow aid to reach those affected in southern Turkey, state-owned Anadolu news agency and a diplomat have said. And the UN's Emergency Relief Coordinator Martin Griffiths has also said that we have failed the people in northwest Syria, and they rightly feel abandoned. In a tweet, he added, "Looking for international help that hasn't arrived. My duty and our obligation is to correct this failure as fast as we can. That's my focus now. So, Siobhan, one practical thing, first of all, it's probably too early to start to learn lessons from what has happened. But undoubtedly, there's always more that can be done to help the aid effort. But are you aware of any moves in Dundee or in Tayside to to raise money or to collect items to be sent to the victims of this disaster in Turkey? I'm thinking I saw mention made by a councillor of a drop-off point at the A1 car wash in Dundee.
Yeah, yeah. Nadia, and that had posted that up as well. There's also a kind of financial funding as well, which I think is more of a kind of national one. But yeah, I mean, I think in times like this, people want to help. And that's certainly the one thing that we Dundee together, that people actually just start on the ground and say, what do we do? What can we help? And how can we help? The issue, of course, with the complexities of Syria is that, we can collect as much as is needed. It's getting it across, which is going to be the biggest barrier, and that's where the politics of things come into that. And I think this is the same across the board in most disasters, isn't it? Is that ordinary people put aside all political notions. It's that humanity, I think, that comes through, but it's the political blocks that often cause the frustrations. I mean, no help went into Syria for 3 days because there's only one, UN sanctioned border into Syria, and they were waiting and waiting and waiting, and that quote holds true, isn't it? Nothing came. They waited, and no support came through, and we're still trying to negotiate getting support into Syria and into all areas of Syria that are not just government controlled. So there's that huge gulf, isn't there, between ordinary people trying to help and the political machinations that get in the way of that. I don't know how we resolve that, but that is one thing we really do need to start thinking about, isn't it? Is that it's I feel a wee bit like it's as we're beginning to question things like our basic human rights across the board, as human rights begins to crumble, these kind of politics gets in the way because the human rights are almost kind of beginning to be squashed. So there's that kind of element, I think, that we always have to face, that the politics get in the way of humanity of the disaster. And that's always tragic. It's a horrendous situation. It's a horrendous situation, and I think that people do feel that.
I think that's absolutely right, Siobhan. In the summary there that I just read out, I mentioned Syria two or three times,
Mm,
and you've mentioned it as well. Obviously, the majority of the focus is on Turkey because that's where the
yeah.
majority of the people who are affected are. However, as a number of people, including the UN Emergency Relief Coordinator Martin Griffiths, have pointed out, and you have too, we have failed the people of northwest Syria. Now, would it be fair to say that the world has failed the people of northwest Syria for a very long time, and that this is just the latest example of them being either ignored or forgotten about by the world's community?
I mean, this is not a nation that has been thriving, shall we say, and then suddenly hit with a disaster in the way that maybe some of the wealthier countries were hit with COVID. That we were ticking along relatively nicely, and then COVID came and just kind of like a bolt out of the blue. There's like 2.6 million people displaced in Syria. There's 4.1 million dependent on aid in Syria, and that's before the earthquake happened. So you're talking about a vulnerable nation, subject to massive political machinations. All opposition is classed as terrorist groups. So, you have that kind of constant battle, and you have those constant politics of who gets what. And that's what's happening now, is that, the governments are giving some aid, but they're deciding where that aid goes. But actually, they're not going to give it to terrorist organisations, but actually terrorist organisations are opposition. So you've got that kind of politics of it as well. So it is. It's like you're talking about a kind of vulnerable nation that's suddenly been struck with a huge disaster, and we cut aid. Remember, the UK cut aid. We cut the foreign aid, and that's kind of obviously caused some problems for many kind of vulnerable nations across the board. It's left them less resilient, and that's the issue now, isn't it? That you've got humanitarian disaster, kind of, as you said, creeping in for decades, and then suddenly you've got this horrible, immediate, unexpected disaster, which is just going to make it so much worse. And still, no help or very little help is going into that country. So it really is, and I know it's that we have a tendency. I was speaking to a friend yesterday, and we have a tendency to talk about Turkey, and it's horrible, but there is an element. Just because it's less people, it's a lot more vulnerable and a lot more tentative across there. No support for 3 days. No support. They waited for 3 days, and we couldn't get in to the UN border, the one UN border that's open into Syria. And that's, I mean, that's a terrifying prospect in itself. I think feeling that no one's coming.
I think that's absolutely right, Siobhan. Thank you. We'll come back to the UK now for our next item, because on Friday, disturbances broke out in Knowsley near Liverpool after several hundred far-right demonstrators protested against asylum seekers who have been housed in a local hotel by the Home Office. 15 people, including a 13-year-old boy, were arrested after a police van was attacked with hammers and set alight, and fireworks were thrown at police officers. Witnesses at the Suites Hotel said missiles were thrown and far-right supporters had set the police van and its equipment on fire. Claire Mosley, the founder of the charity Care for Cali, which supports asylum seekers and who attended the demonstration to support those in the hotel, said, "I don't know if the asylum seekers will be safe. I am deeply shocked and shaken by what I have witnessed in Liverpool tonight." Knowsley's Labour MP, Sir George Howarth, said that the demonstration was triggered by an alleged incident posted on social media and criticised misinformation about refugees being feather-bedded in the hotel. The people of Knowsley are not bigots and are welcoming to people escaping from some of the most dangerous places in the world in search of a place of safety, he wrote. Those demonstrating against refugees at this protest do not represent this community. We are not like that and overwhelmingly behave with sympathy and kindness to others, regardless of where they come from. In a tweet, Stand Up to Racism blamed the violence on the government's scapegoating of refugees. The Home Secretary remained silent until late yesterday afternoon. Eventually, she wrote a brief statement on Twitter. It said, "I condemn the appalling violence in Knowsley last night. The alleged behaviour of some asylum seekers is never an excuse for violence and intimidation. Thank you to Mersey police officers for keeping everyone safe." That statement has been widely condemned. Daniel Sohedge, the director of human rights organisation Stand for All, wrote, "Finally, could have done without the seemingly tacit victim blaming of asylum seekers, though." The University of Glasgow law professor James Chalmers commented, "Astonishing that the condemnation is both slow to arrive and qualified by reference to alleged behaviour." And the human rights lawyer Shoaib Khan said it was disingenuous for Braverman to condemn the violence when she had used inflammatory rhetoric against asylum seekers. He wrote, "You called the people in these hotels invaders and criminals. Now you're blaming the British public for not wanting them in their community. When the government continuously tells people their country is being invaded by dangerous criminals and that the government's hands are tied because of lefty loony laws, what is the public expected to do?" So, Siobhan, firstly, do you think can a line be drawn between the anti-immigrant, anti-asylum seeker, anti-refugee rhetoric that we've heard from David Cameron, from Priti Patel, from Suella Braverman, and from can a line be drawn between that rhetoric and these English nationalists who've been rioting near Liverpool?
It exists on a continuum, doesn't it? I think we have had a decade or more of anti-immigrant, anti-asylum seeker rhetoric. It's even the combination of the two, as one or the other, makes it kind of difficult. I can't remember which university it was. I think it might have been Birmingham, but I could be wrong. They did a study on newspapers and the cultural opinion of people regarding asylum seekers, and it was noted that the newspapers like the Sun and the Daily Mail actually systematically fed in to the images that people experience psychologically of asylum seekers. So those images of, the one here that's been used as sexual predator, isn't it? I mean, that was a man approached a young girl. We don't know whether that act was true or not, but it has been conflated on social media. Migrants are migrants are kind of now looming over our children. So there's that trope that's kind of seems to have kind of rolled out in the social media and played out in the social media there as well. But there's lots of negative images that set in people's minds about asylum seekers and about immigrants and about Muslims as well, because it's often conflated as well. Terrorism was often used when thinking about Muslim immigration and Muslim asylum seekers too. So yes, I think very much so, and I think that for the UK government to sit back and go, "Oh, isn't that terrible?" and take no responsibility for that is part of the problem. Is part of the problem, because what they're doing is they're trying to siphon off what the actions that they are doing that are clearly influencing the imagery and the public opinion of people regarding asylum seekers. We are talking vulnerable people who are fleeing war and horrific environment. We've just been talking about Syria here, where there's masses of vulnerable people and I think, and actually, if you think back, the rhetoric surrounding David Cameron did lead to less Syrian refugees coming here. It specifically led to that because we didn't want to take responsibility for that. You've got vulnerable people coming across here, and then they're being terrorised by extreme right-wing organisations. Now, to be fair, some of the reports are saying that some people were riled up, shall we say, because of the social media text that was kind of bandying around regarding kind of children being around migrants, shall we say, approaching children. We'll just leave it at that. So there was some people riled up, and then there was other people that came along and tried to protect the asylum seekers and promote a kind of a tolerance and understanding. And then from the eyewitness accounts, there were people that come later intent on causing trouble. So you've kind of got three groups there, but it does facilitate it. There was, I'm going to shout out to Becky Johnson, the Sky News reporter for Midlands, who did a very, very good article talking about, talking about the problems of the social media, talking about the whipping up that happened online. That's not disconnected either with the rhetoric that the government spews out. You've got this toxic mix now of this anti-asylum seeker rhetoric. Then you've got these kind of social media frenzies, moral panics is the word I've been looking for the last couple of minutes. Social media moral panics that create people in turmoil and eventually want to blame someone. So that's where that mob came from. It must have been absolutely terrifying. I think it was Becky Johnson interviewed an Egyptian teacher who's come across here and says, "We thought this place was safe and look what's happening. This is horrendous. We don't know what's going on here." So there really is a massive, massive problem here. It's such a toxic mix. And, for those that are shouting out, Claire Mosley, I think, was very good in that. And her point was, if something has happened, if there has been something, an incident, report it to the police. Do not talk, do not kind of rock up mob-handed and expect justice to be done in that way. This is the problem now. You've got mobs. We had a situation just not that long ago in Dundee where mobs kind of, they turned up outside, I don't even know, so-called paedophile's house. Hundreds of people turned up, inspired and initiated by social media. So you've got this kind of real problem now. It's a horrendous situation. It's a horrible situation to experience. And I'm looking at kind of people in Knowsley. These are a small amount of people, but what they do is they initiate hate and they initiate fear, and now they're initiating violence as well. And that's a terrifying situation to be in. And, thinking back to things like, men that went out and fought the Spanish Civil War, we don't often see fascism where it is, but it feels a little fascistic here. I'm not going to lie. Not the people that turned up scared, those that came in with the hammers and the fireworks, those that deliberately came in to try and cause trouble. And that feels slightly fascistic to me, I'm going to be honest. And I think that the government has to take responsibility for whipping up that rhetoric. The only way we can stop this is to stop the moral panic and start rehumanising the asylum seekers who are, again, I'll repeat, vulnerable people that are fleeing war and other massive humanitarian crises.
Thanks, Siobhan. And just to take this item one step further, of course, this week we had the elevation to the role of deputy party leader of the Tories, of Lee 30p Anderson. In an entirely predictable turn of events, it's been pointed out that Anderson, the MP for Ashfield, who was described last summer in the press as, and I quote, the worst man in England, closely associates with well-known far-right thugs, and then, of course, to seal his reputation as a champion of the perpetually hard of thinking, he then spoke out and voiced support for the reintroduction of the death penalty. So how long do you think it is before this current Tory party and this Tory government moves to, in the context of justice, as you say, and fear and violence, how soon do you think it is before the Tory party shifts its ground and moves to a position of supporting the reintroduction of the death penalty?
It's funny, isn't it? Because it's the death penalty is a topic that I was talking about this the other day. It's suddenly come out of nowhere, isn't it? I mean, it's almost kind of this settled well that we don't do that. That's the UK have never done this for decades, and why should we do this now? And then suddenly it's back on the agenda because of this guy Lee Anderson. There's so many lines being crossed by these successive Tory governments, and it really is a sense of, I always say, careful what you wish for, because the next one always seems worse. So there's that element that ever since Brexit, we've had this increasing shift to the right, to the right, to the right, to the right, to the right. The ground shifts so fast sometimes that you can almost feel it moving from under your feet, and it's always a rightward shift. That's the problem that we have. The social contract, the democratic model, the human rights model are beginning to be disintegrated bit by bit, and at an actual incredibly fast pace as well. So I don't know. The answer is I don't know, but it feels at this moment in time that anything is possible. And in a scary way, actually, because we're shifting so far. You just need to look at what's happened in a Scottish context. And, well, just happened over the last couple of weeks. We've had Scottish Parliament being overrid. We've had the right to strike beginning to get taken away. We're getting the right workers' rights getting taken away. All these rights that we used to think were sacrosanct are now not. And is this one of those rights that the sacrosanct right, the right for the state not to kill, is that suddenly going to shift as well? We don't know. And compile that with the racist rhetoric. Look at the US. The prison system is full of ethnic minority people, not because they're naturally criminals, but because they've been criminalised. And that's the issue that we have now as well. It's not. It's a terrifying prospect, quite frankly. I'm dead against the death penalty, but it's not just that. It's there's more than that, as you say. It's part of a bigger right wing initiation here, and if we're not careful, it will become deep seated within the UK. Those new laws, those new kind of stripping of rights, they'll become the new norm. They'll become the new social contract, and it'll be hard to kind of unstrip those.
It will. It will. But I'm sure we've got if it comes to that, we'll have the energy to do that if necessary. But Siobhan, you mentioned the
Independence.
US there, and I was going to take you to North America next for our next item, because a US warplane shot down an identified object over North American airspace, the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said yesterday. This was the second day in a row in which the US military shot down an unidentified airborne object. I ordered the takedown of an unidentified object that violated Canadian airspace, Trudeau tweeted yesterday afternoon. A US F-22 fighter plane with the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, which protects Canadian and American airspace, shot down the object over the Yukon. Fighter jets have now shot down 3 objects in the airspace above the US and Canada in the last week. The Canadian Defence Minister, Anita Anand, declined to speculate about the origin of the latest object, which she said was cylindrical in shape. She stopped short of describing it as a balloon, but said it was smaller than the Chinese balloon shot down off South Carolina's coast a week ago, but she said it was similar in appearance. She said it was flying at 40,000 feet and proposed a risk to civilian air traffic when it was shot down. The shooting down of these objects over Canada and Alaska, as I say, comes a week after the US military took down a Chinese spy balloon off the coast of South Carolina on the 4th of February. Though Chinese officials apologized for the balloon and said it was a civilian airship meant for weather research, US officials maintained that the balloon was carrying equipment capable of intercepting and geolocating communications and did not have any equipment consistent with weather balloons. US officials say the balloon was part of a fleet that has been used to collect intelligence in more than 40 countries on 5 continents. They maintain the balloons went into US airspace at least 3 times during the former President Donald Trump's presidency and twice so far during Biden's. So, Siobhan, when I started reading these reports, I'll admit they struck me personally as being very 1960s Cold War. All I could see in my head was the set of the film Ice Station Zebra and Rock Hudson. But so, apart from Alistair MacLean novels, what do you think's going on here? Is it helpful, perhaps, to try and work out who benefits from these stories appearing at this time?
I just want to keep going. Sorry, do 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 do. You know, it's kind of it does feel very sci-fi, doesn't it? Yeah, I mean, I don't know what to make of this. I'm going to be honest. I don't know. I mean, the New York Times was kind of certainly pushing the kind of Chinese spy balloon line on that, and there's clearly some concern. But it's a difficult one to fathom, isn't it? But you're right. Who does benefit? I honestly, I'm flummoxed and I'm not normally, but I honestly don't know what to make of this. What is it? I mean, it's not maybe a coincidence that a Chinese spy balloon was kind of like was found just a few weeks ago. So it does feel like maybe they're on high alert for other things and a bit worried about. I think it was maybe the New York Times as well. It said that they were applying an uber cautious approach to anything that seems certainly unusual at this point in time. But the cylindrical object just struck me, stuck. The old 1950s movie. Maybe we are moving into that again. I don't know.
Thanks, Siobhan. It is. I suspect. I'm sure there'll be more stories before we get more enlightenment with regard to what's going on over North American airspace. So I'm sure we'll come back to this story again pretty soon. But let's move on now, because the Guardian website reports this morning that an extraordinary cross-party summit bringing together leading Leavers and Remainers, including Michael Gove and senior members of Keir Starmer's shadow cabinet, has been held in high secrecy to address the failings of Brexit and how to remedy them in the national interest. The 2-day gathering of some of the country's most senior Labour and Tory politicians from both sides of the Brexit debate, together with diplomats, defence experts, and the heads of some of the biggest businesses and banks, was held at Ditchley Park in Oxfordshire on Thursday afternoon and evening and on Friday. Documents from the meeting obtained by The Observer describe it as a private discussion under the title, "How can we make Brexit work better with our neighbours in Europe?" Those in attendance from the pro-Brexit side include the former Tory party leader Michael Howard, former Tory Chancellor Norman Lamont, and the former Labour Europe Minister Gisela Stewart, one of the leading figures in the Leave campaign. Among prominent Remainer politicians present were David Lammy, the former Shadow Defence Secretary John Healey, and the former European Commissioner and Labour Cabinet Minister Peter Mandelson. From the Tory Remainer camp, the ex-Cabinet Minister and long-serving Minister for Europe, David Liddington, attended. A confidential introductory statement for those at the meeting acknowledged that there was now a view among some at least that as far as the UK has not yet found its way forward outside the EU, with Brexit acting as a drag on our growth and inhibiting the UK's potential. A source who was there said the main thrust of it was that Britain is losing out, that Brexit is not delivering, and our economy is in a weak position. It's about moving on from Leave and Remain, and what are the issues we now have to face, and how can we get into the best position in order to have a conversation with the EU about changes to the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement when that happens. The highly unusual cross-party nature of the gathering and the seniority of those who attended reflects a growing acceptance amongst politicians in the two main parties, as well as business and the civil service, that Brexit in its current form is damaging the UK economy and reducing its strategic influence in the world. Concern is growing at the top of the Labour Party that this poses a real threat to the success of any future Labour government unless problems such as increased trade friction can be addressed. Remember, the Office for Budget Responsibility has predicted that over the 15 years from 2016, Brexit will reduce the UK's gross domestic product per capita by 4%. So, Siobhan, firstly, what's going on here? Do you think are Norman Lamont and Gisela Stewart the ones who hold the key to unlock the door to the sunlit uplands of Brexit Island?
Shocking. It utterly is disgraceful that they're like having a secret meeting, right? And going, oh, wait a minute, was this the right thing to do? Well, yeah, Gimlock, we told you that years ago. Everybody knew that this was a disaster waiting to happen. Every single all knew it. And we had this extreme right-wing campaign. Do you remember this kind of brand new, kind of innovative, but extremely right-wing campaign that basically pushed to the point of kind of verging on creepy levels of trying to persuade people that Brexit was the best thing to do. You know, remember the kind of whole, the 350 million on the bus. It was much more than that. You had Nigel Farage whipping up again the right wing. Our borders are full, our country is full. You know, all this anti-immigration, right-wing rhetoric that just pushed this Brexit campaign. And then they surprised themselves by actually winning, because I don't think anybody really thought we'd win. And then they didn't have one single plan or one single clue on what to do as a result of that. And we're still paying the price. But worse than that, immediately afterwards, they tried to suppress the parliamentary process. Do you remember? One of the first things they did was try to bypass the parliament in terms of what that Brexit might look like. So they started that immediate process of stripping democracy, and then they continued. And if it couldn't get any worse, what did they actually do? They took us out of Europe in the middle of a global pandemic, when the global economy was literally on stasis anyway. And then suddenly they do this meeting going, I wonder if this is not quite working out. It's absolutely shocking. I swear to God, I hope David Lammy was in that meeting and went, I can told you this was going to happen. You know, this is shocking. Absolutely shocking that they've caused so much damage to the UK as a whole, to our economy, to our young people, to our freedom of borders, to every single thing that we held dear within the European Union, to our workers' rights, by the way, because the new replacement EU law is about to strip us of our workers' rights. Well, that's the concern of the Scottish Government and the unions as well. So there's a whole host of stuff here that has led us to a completely vicious economy that actually causes damage to our vulnerable, and damage to our youngest, and damage to our kind of most poorest people in the nation as well. And then they're suddenly turning around going, what are we going to do? And were we right? Were we not? This is shocking. I just cannot believe, just when you think it cannot get any worse, just when you think that they cannot get any worse, they suddenly come with this. And do you know what as well? There is no self-reflection in this. There's no responsibility taken for this. They're still trying to pretend. It's like, oh, well, it's maybe not as good as what we thought. But, you know, if we just be a little bit more right-wing, because that's what it seems to be, if we just be a little bit more right-wing and a little bit more intransigent to the EU, then maybe we'll get a wee bit further forward. And I'm going to do one final rant here, because this drives me mental. Shame on Labour. Shame on Labour for this. Absolute shame that they're allowing this to happen. And I know that there was a left argument for Brexit. I get that. I understand that. I think it was wrong, and I argued against it at the time, but I understand that it was there. But even if you argued for that, the recognition that it wasn't anything left immediately after Brexit should have been recognised, that this was who was it the ex-Conservative said? It's been, the party was taken over by a right-wing cabal. Okay, that's what drove Brexit, and the Labour Party should have recognised that and backed off immediately and started creating a strategy for the return of Europe. The only party in Scotland that is now supportive of Europe is the SNP. Every single other and the Greens, sorry, apologies, the Greens as well. Every single other political party is now, as you said in that report, is now kind of, ugh, well, it's not Remain or Leave. We'll just have to accept it as is. No, do you know what? We don't need to accept this as is. We go for independence, and we go for independence within Europe, because the Europe is, in my opinion, the settled will of the people of Scotland. That's what people want. People want back into Europe, precisely because we all knew it was going to be absolutely disastrous, and we're reaping the benefits of that now. Or sorry, reaping the horrors of that now.
Yes. No, I get you completely, Siobhan. And actually,
Sorry.
just to expand on that point you were just making, I was going to ask you. We know that this Tory government is playing out of policy or ideas now, but is that the same? Do you think for Labour? Do you think has Labour thinking also been captured by the right?
I think so. I think so, and I think that's historically, I kind of studied the labor movement as part of my PhD, and I think historically it's always been the problem of the Labour Party is they always they seem to have kind of quite a good. I mean, apart from 1945, I think they seem to have kind of quite a good structure, and then there's a shift to the right, and they never kind of try and rebrand or rethink how the left wing perception could be sold again to the public. They just think if we turn a bit more right, then we'll maybe do it. So, and I think it might have been Mike Russell that said it the other day. Why would you vote for a kind of weaker version of conservatism? And this is the lesson that they never ever seem to learn. They think if we shift a little bit to the right, that'll be fine. That's what they did. They shifted and tried to win over the Brexiteers, and it failed. It failed disastrously. And I think that is the problem that we have now. We've got a weak leader through Keir Starmer, who's kind of quite bereft of ideas and policies. I think that doesn't mean to say there's not a lot of good people, Labour people on the ground. I think there is, but they really are. Both parties I see are collapsing in on themselves. They seem to exist themselves in an internal contradiction that they can never quite resolve. I was having a conversation a wee while ago about, is the Conservative Party damaged itself beyond return? Have they got to the point where they'll be out of politics for generation upon generation? What's more scary, perhaps, is the fact that Labour seems to offer nothing. Labour doesn't seem to offer that much. There's a lot of kind of good talk, but it doesn't seem to be. Europe's a perfect example, isn't it? Europe's the perfect example. They still don't have a, anywhere near a coherent strategy for what it means to be outside Europe, or actually, should we be rethinking the European question? Because if we look at the latest polls, Scotland's different. Scotland's always been pro-European. So, but if you look at even the polls in England, there is a shift. There's a shift towards thinking, actually, maybe Brexit was a disaster. Oh, right, okay, maybe we should be rethinking it. But the Labour Party just seem to be doggedly sticking to this. Well, it's done and dusted. Let's move on with it. That's not good enough.
That's a very good point that you make, Siobhan. And just to tie a couple of threads together a little bit, uh, as you were saying, this secret meeting appears to have been a little bit about trying to uh, see how voters in England, and to your point, it is voters in England, to see if they are able to move on from the events of 2016. And I asked that because the campaign then suggested strongly to me that voters in England had not really moved on from the 1930s and 1945 in many ways. So do you think there's a chance that voters now, in the 21st century no less, that voters in England will be able to move on from 2016?
Do you know what? I hope for their sake, yes. I think that if you look at I suppose the recent history of Scotland, that we had a kind of a rethink about what our society is in 2012 to 14 through the independence referendum. Now, that's not necessarily, I mean, we lost that referendum, but what it did do, I think, was Scotland rethought their relationship to a lot of things. It also rethought its relationship to the social democratic model. And I think that what we decided ultimately is, whilst we didn't want independence, we did want that social democratic model. We wanted that post 45 model, suppose in a modernised form. England almost kind of have moved away from that increasingly. But sometimes there are shifts, and it looks like maybe there is a shift in England that is beginning to think that, well, actually, maybe we need something more than being subject to the ravages of a free market. And that's kind of pretty much what the right wing kind of Conservative government are doing now. So maybe there is a shift in that thinking that will allow England to kind of change its perception. Maybe that's a post-COVID thing as well, because I think, one of the lessons we did learn, I think, collectively, is that, we have to work collectively in order to survive and thrive as a society. And that was a very protective mechanism. But, maybe that's the lesson that England are beginning to recognise. And maybe the Labour Party need to be a bit more in touch with that.
Absolutely. Thanks, Siobhan. We'll move on now because a report from by MPs in the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Committee has found that the BBC chairman made significant errors of judgment by acting as a go-between to help facilitate a loan guarantee for the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson, while he was also seeking the role with the broadcaster. Sharp has insisted that he did not arrange the loan, but he has admitted introducing his friend Sam Blythe, a distant cousin of Boris Johnson, who wanted to help the then Prime Minister with his reported financial troubles, to the Cabinet Office. The SNP MP John Nicholson, who sits on the Commons Digital Culture, Media and Sport Committee, said that Richard Sharp's position is extremely difficult. He told BBC's Sunday with Laura Kuenssberg, "He has lost the trust of the BBC staff, that's very clear. I have been deluged with messages from BBC staff saying they don't see how he can head up the BBC anymore." And he broke the rules. The rules are very clear. When you sign up for that job application, you are asked if there's anything in your relationships with anybody that could cause embarrassment. This has clearly caused embarrassment. We knew that he was a very big Tory donor. We knew he had given hundreds of thousands of pounds to the Conservative Party, but he didn't tell us that he had facilitated an £800,000 loan for Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, who then gave him this job. It's all a bit Banana Republic. So, Siobhan, a bit Banana Republic. Is this not what Tory voters in England wanted, isn't it? It's precisely what they voted for. Corruption, kleptocracy, increasing inequality, failure of public services, and a perpetual cultural war.
I don't know if the people in England voted for that, to be perfectly honest. I think that sometimes we have a mistrust or a hope that the governments will do right by us, even though sometimes the evidence stares us in the face. I think if you asked an average voter, do you fancy a corrupt government? Of course they're going to say no. It's just how it's all been wrapped up. And politics, as we've just been talking about, it's a highly manipulative process, and can actually steer public opinion quite easily, quite scarily easily so. But this is, I mean, even to me, I mean, putting aside even the kind of, before we get to the kind of the facilitation of the loan, the very fact that he was a donor to the Conservative Party, I would have thought would have ruled him out. I mean, you know, the very fact, I mean, let's get, even before they never even investigated that to me would still be seen as corrupt. How do you become the kind of general of the BBC if you're given masses of donations to the Conservative government? That's how do you promise to be neutral in that? We can't have neutral, and we know from Scotland, because we've been subject to that kind of lack of neutrality when it comes to kind of things like the referendum, but people in England, I think, are beginning to recognise that as well. So even putting that aside, how on earth he managed to get that job in the first place kind of just fills me with I just don't know. The issue of the loan, though, oh my lord! I mean, the Independent actually done a very good timeline, and it was literally this all happened within a space of a couple of months. Sharp's going, yeah, yeah, okay, right, okay, let's get that sorted out for you, Boris. And then it's like, oh right, there's this brilliant job come up. Do you think I should apply for it? Oh, that's a brilliant idea, And then literally, it's all happened within the space of a couple of months, and then then they have a wee meeting saying you might not want to mention that. This is disgraceful. And it's not just the BBC that should be held over the coals for this. It's not just him that should be held over the coals. It should be the government that's held over the coals as well, because Boris Johnson was part of that process. And there's this whole discussion now about Boris Johnson and how he's brought politics to sewer level. And that is an absolute example of that. Am I right in thinking, and I don't want to kind of misquote, but I thought I read somewhere as well that Sharp was also previously Rishi Sunak's boss at one point. So
That's
we're
correct.
all connected here, So this is what will begin to destroy. Well, this is what is destroying, I think, the Conservative government at this moment. It's one corruption after another, and I know a lot of the focus is on what Sharp did and all that kind of stuff, but we've got to absolutely consider the role of the government here as well, because that is just, how do you even begin to think that that's okay? I think that shows you the level of corruption that is there. The very fact that you think that A, that's okay, and B, that'll never get found out. An error in judgment. Are you actually absolutely kidding me? There is no way you can interpret this apart from being but corrupt. And anyone that works in public office, anyone from low level to kind of prime minister, have to be absolutely aware at every single level how this will look. And they must have known, and they tried to cover it up. That's what it looks like to me. They knew and they tried to cover it up, and that's a whole new level as well. It's quite shocking. Can you imagine if somebody in the Scottish government did that? Yeah, oh my God, they wouldn't. And that's the point. We're held to much higher standards. The process is much more. This is a Westminster issue. This is a Westminster issue. It's corrupt to the core now.
That's a very good point, Siobhan. I was actually, and I will. I was going to pivot with you for a moment, having been looking at Westminster and the media in the UK. I was going to pivot for a moment to look perhaps at the media in Scotland, because on Friday the SNP president Mike Russell condemned what he called a unionist-inspired media feeding frenzy
Yeah.
targeting Nicola Sturgeon, warning that the attacks on her leadership are designed to delegitimise the cause of independence. Writing in his weekly national column, the former Constitution Secretary said that much of the commentary around transgender prisoners isn't about policy, arguing it is largely populated by venomous attacks on our First Minister.
Mm.
Referring to various suggestions for how to secure independence, from Holyrood to Westminster elections or alternative plans, such as those floated by Stuart MacDonald MP, Mike Russell said that all views are welcome because they make a more democratic Scotland. And he went on, that is, of course, why they are being opposed tooth and nail in what has been a unionist-inspired media feeding frenzy, targeted at Nicola Sturgeon, with the aim of trying to decapitate the party, demonise the leadership, derail the discussion, and delegitimise what we are seeking to achieve. So it struck me, you used the words moral panic earlier on when we were talking this afternoon. Is that what we're seeing in the unionist press in Scotland at the moment? A confected moral panic in attempt to spread disinformation and alarm?
I think so. I think so. And but there is an element here. I mean, I think it's, Better Together has moved into campaign mode. Okay. I think that there has been denial for a wee while. But I think that the immediate Section 35 was for me the beginning of the campaign. And so what we've got is this onslaught, and I think Mike Russell is absolutely right. And I was looking at some of the coverage this morning actually on Nicola Sturgeon, and it is very personalised, and it is, the attempt to this comes up a lot. Usually when the SNP or the independence movement make a gain, you end up with this kind of like, when will Nicola Sturgeon retire? So you've got that kind of scenario coming in, pictures of her looking exhausted, pictures of her being out of touch with the people, kind of thing. And I'm not going to get too much into the trans element of it. Different people have different opinions, but to use the trans community in that way because they knew it would be it would be a way of kind of breaking the chink in the independence armour. We're literally only kind of catching up with many countries in this in terms of best practice. To use that community though to slap down the Scottish government, it was really quite a kind of, I think, a bad move, and I hope it will backfire on them. The issue we now have, and this is one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot and talking about a lot, is we have an onslaught against democracy. Within Scotland, we have had the right to a referendum refused. We're beginning to see our Scottish Parliament being overruled. We're beginning to have our union rights stripped from us. We're beginning to have our workers' rights stripped from us. All that democracy, all that human rights that we value and hold dear is now being stripped. No wonder they hate a democratic process. And I'll tell you something though, which is interesting. As an SNP member, we've had quite a few branch discussions regarding the motion and the way forward. Now that the Supreme Court has said we can't legislate through the Scottish Parliament, the engagement has been very, very good. It has been a genuinely, I think, democratic process. We had a 2-hour conversation on Friday about the motion, the options, what that means for us, how we will build that, what we will say, what we will bring to the conference as a branch and as delegates, and what we will change, what we didn't want changed, what we wanted to do. So there is the kind of part of that democratic process that's beginning to process. And yes, of course they're going to go for Nicola Sturgeon because Nicola Sturgeon has led us to this point and in an incredibly good manner. Even the way she dealt with the prison issue, the kind of Section 35, it was dealt with grace, understanding, tact, humanity. And those are qualities that Westminster seem to have forgotten about. And it shows, I think the way Nicola Sturgeon works shows a very different way of politicking. Is it Jacinda Ardern? When she, I mean, obviously, unfortunately, she has kind of tendered a resignation as Prime Minister in New Zealand. And one of the things she says she wants to be known for is bringing humanity and caring back into the political system. And I think that's an amazing thing. And I think that there is a bit of that in Nicola Sturgeon as well, which they are trying to squash out. But do you know what? We are, and this is where I get really positive. We are in, this is a historian in me speaking, we are in the transition to independence now. The minute Nicola Sturgeon announced that she was taking the case to the Supreme Court, that was the starting gun for me towards the independence. So we couldn't stop this historical push, even if we wanted to. Nicola Sturgeon can stand up tomorrow and say, right, I'm stopping. I don't think that would stop it. I think the push for independence is too strong now and moving too fast that we probably couldn't stop it, even if we wanted to. We are in the middle of this transition. And this is, I think, the British state probably catching up, and the British press and the Conservative and Labour governments beginning to catch up and think, oh, right, what this is actually happening now. One of the things that we discussed at the branch meeting on Friday was, well, we need to send a powerful message. We want a referendum, but in the absence of that, we need to send a powerful message. We need to show that the people of Scotland want this, that we are acting on behalf of the people of Scotland, because we do have mandate after mandate after mandate. And this is the beginning of the battle. But no one said that this was going to be easy. You know, we knew that this was coming. We knew that, you know, it will be full on propaganda. But we've survived that before, and actually it backfired, and it only gave us more strength. I don't think it will change the trajectory that we have towards independence. It will just make it a bit more exhausting, maybe.
Thanks, Siobhan. Absolutely, resolution and resilience are undoubtedly key component parts of any campaign, and unusually for Scotland and for the full Scottish. What I'd like to do quickly is just to squeeze in a little bit of sports news at the end of this programme, because the applause for an unprecedented 2 wins from 2 in the Six Nations continued long after the final whistle yesterday at Murrayfield. And the cheers of Scotland's fans were still ringing in his ears, but Gregor Townsend is now more interested in gearing up for the next 2 matches, France in Paris in a fortnight and Ireland back at Murrayfield in a month. It feels like an improved performance, our coach said, of this record 35-7 win over Wales. If it was a 7 out of 10 last week against England, it's moved up to an 8, and we'll have to improve again. The next two teams we play are ranked 1 and 2 in the world. We'll have to get 9 out of 10 to beat them. Townsend also paid tribute to his former teammate Dodie Weir after the first Test match at Murrayfield since his death at the end of November. We were playing for a trophy that meant a lot to us. It's unusual to play for trophies in the Six Nations. We play for the Calcutta Cup, which is the oldest trophy in the world, and that motivates us. Now, this trophy motivates us, the Dodie Weir Cup. He'd be proud. Today was a big day for his wife, Kathy, and the boys, for them to feel the love that everyone's got for the family, and for Dodie's legacy made this a very special milestone today. But I'm afraid, looking at the clock, that's all the time that we have for you this afternoon. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of our viewers. Please help us to continue to make these programmes for you. Our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 per month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of raising £30,000 so that we can pay the bills. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who's signed up to make a regular monthly payment as a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, thank you very much. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you'd like to volunteer, please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter at BroadcastScot, on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland, and if you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe to us there. Please click on the wee bell. Now, we will all be back tomorrow evening at 7 with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please come back and join us again then. And of course, I'd like to thank everyone who's been watching this afternoon, and I'd like to say a very special thanks to our very special guest this evening, Cllr Siobhan Tolland. Thanks, Siobhan.
Thank you.
Thanks, Siobhan. Now, very quickly, on the 1st of February 1691, 2 companies of troops were moved south from Fort William and were billeted in Glencoe. The troops were commanded by Robert Campbell of Glenlyon, a 60-year-old alcoholic bankrupt. He was probably put in charge of this because he was unlikely to question his orders. Those orders arrived duly in writing on the 12th of February. They were from Major Duncanson in Fort William, and Campbell and his men were to fall upon the rebels and put all to the sword under 70. This was to happen at 5 a.m. the following morning, the 13th of February. We'll maybe say a little bit more about those events tomorrow on Scotland at 7. Meantime, I hope that you have a very peaceful weekend. Bye-bye.